I've had a great time here, hanging out with some eminent ornithologists. I'm looking forward to hanging out with you guys as well to learn as much as possible. It's been a great time. Who I am. I'm David Lindo, also known as the Urban Birder, and I'll tell you why I'm called the Urban Birder in a minute. But firstly, let me explain that I lived in an area which was basically migrants, so it's mostly Afro-Caribbean and Irish people. But no one around me, not even my family, had any interest whatsoever. I had this innate interest. And I remember as a kid seeing birds out my back window. That was my nature reserve. That was my learning ground. Seeing sparrows, and sparrows to me, I called them baby birds. I called them as I saw them. Starlings were mummy birds. Blackbirds, which is our version of the American robin, was the daddy bird. Until I, as a kid, around 7 years old, found a couple of books in the library, and it was like finding the Holy Scriptures. I found this book on birds of Britain, Middle East, and North Africa. 1,000 species. I couldn't believe it. I read this book inside out, back to front, sideways, upside down. I took it into my school. I read it during my lessons. I was called Bird Brain by my fellow pupils. But by the age of 8, I did my 10,000 hours, my Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours. I was a veritable walking encyclopedia on birds. I led my first tour when I was about 13, and here I am in Scotland, just to prove that I was out there. And as a teenager, I really was totally and utterly into it. And often when I speak in England, I tell people you don't have to wear green, you can have an afro and wear nice trainers going birding. But I was told from a very early age that birds and other wildlife are only to be found in the countryside. But I had no one to take me. So inadvertently, I looked around me and I realized that actually in the middle of the city, where I was born and raised, there were tons of birds, absolutely loads. And I'll talk a bit more about the numbers of birds. But now, I am the Urban Birder. I was born as the Urban Birder 19 years ago, so I'm quite young. A bit more enthusiasm with that one, please. It came about because I was birding all my life, and I was actually, my local patch in London was a place called Wormwood Scrubs. And for those who live in Britain, Wormwood Scrubs is also the name of a notorious prison that was on the same patch of ground, basically. But it was a park surrounded by urbanity. And I started watching this park about 25 years ago, and my friends were saying, what the hell are you going there for? Why don't you go somewhere proper to go birding? But I was drawn to birding in an urban area because I felt that when you are actually out in an urban area, you are an urban explorer. You actually are discovering things that no one else sees because everyone's out there in the middle of nowhere. I prefer to be in the middle of somewhere. But anyway, long story short, the BBC approached me and asked if I would be on their program called Spring Watch, which is their biggest natural history program, to talk about my local patch. And the night before, I remember seeing the crew and the director said to me, tomorrow when you go out there, David, be yourself, tell us about what you know and all that sort of stuff. So I went home after them saying to me or asking me for a screen test, and I was thinking, screen test me? Why? But outwardly I was saying, yeah, no problem. I remember going home, pacing up and down the kitchen, thinking, I want to be the next David Attenborough. I want to be clambering over rocks in the Galapagos and going through jungles in Indonesia. And I thought, that's not going to happen. But then I thought, actually, I like city birds. I like wildlife in urban areas. And I thought of the chef, the English chef, Jamie Oliver, who at the time used to call himself the Naked Chef. And I loved the fact he branded himself because it made him stand out, and also his way of delivering, his way of teaching, it actually engaged people like me who couldn't even boil an egg. And I thought, I want to do the same for natural history. So I thought, let me give myself a name. City Birder, what about the Urban Birder? That sounds all right. So the next day, I introduced myself as the Urban Birder, and it's stuck ever since, basically. So I realized that I needed to get involved in this. I wanted to be a presenter initially, but when I realized how small the window of opportunity is in Britain, I realized I had to diversify. So I started writing. I didn't know I could write. I started speaking. I didn't know I could speak, you know. All these things suddenly came into play. I wrote my first book in 2011. I had a year to write it. I wrote it in the last month of that year. And I hope you can't tell when you come to read it. But that's been my way of doing things ever since, really. My latest, well, actually I've done this book as well, which is How to Be an Urban Birder, which is, I hope, the manual that can be used across the world. Even though it was directed at the British public, at the end of the day, it's the same blueprint around the world. And my latest book, by the way, is a children's book called Fly, and I'm really delighted to say it's up for an award in Britain for children's writing, so I was really pleased with that, considering I left school with no examinations. And that's the inside of it as well, so it's all about different birds around the world. Okay, so let me tell you a couple of stories, if I may. Is that okay? I've got to make sure you're still with me. Oh yeah, by the way, talking about stories, I do a lot of work trying to engage people of colour, not only in the UK but around the world, and I often contribute to books. There's another book that I contributed to get young people of colour involved in natural history. And I also write a lot of stuff for various magazines and newspapers on a regular basis. I've got many columns that I write. Anyway, going back to what I was talking about, the first story is based in London, and it's about engagement because, interestingly, as I said earlier, I saw myself as a bit of a pioneer when it came to talking about urban birding, even though I guess it's been in existence ever since there was a first thatched roof or first parking meter, but maybe not under that name. And my idea was to try and engage people in urban areas. My whole ethos is engaging people with nature around the world, but through the medium of birds. So in central London, there's a building which is called Tower 42. At the time, which is about maybe 14 years ago, it was the tallest building in London. And my idea was to get on top of that building and create a bird study group to watch migration. But at least that's what I told the owners of the building. My real thought was to get people to look up. So when they actually agreed, which I couldn't believe it, but they actually agreed to it, the media were really quite interested. What do you mean watching birds of prey? No birds fly over London. And I was so delighted they said that, because it meant that they were aware and ready to be sort of taught about what could happen. Standing on top of this building was beautiful, especially on a lovely sunny day. You can see the whole of London. It looks like an island. And I'd get people to come and join this survey, which was twice weekly during the spring and autumn. It's quite random, really, in many ways. We spent 4 hours in the morning, or 4 hours in the afternoon, just seeing if anything flew over. The sorts of people that came were not necessarily even birders. People would stand on the roof and say, my mum lives over there and my brother lives here. But that's great, because they're noticing their environment. And after a period of time, they start seeing birds. And it's pretty interesting how that started panning out. And we had a regular band of birders that came up every week, should I say, along with other people who weren't birders, who became birders. And we saw all sorts of birds up there, actually. The migration was much better than I expected for central London. We have now nearly, in fact, just over 100 pairs of peregrine nesting in London. Can you believe that? It's probably the biggest urban population in the world. And at any given time, you will see at least 5 or 6 territories. It's just incredible. We saw a lot of other birds fly over, including this exciting bird. Look at that, it's amazing. That is a bird called a honey buzzard, which is really rare in the UK. And I remember being on the roof in spring and seeing this bird flying from the south, because they winter in Africa, and it's probably on its way to Scandinavia, but it was amazing to see it. It flew across, headed off north. About an hour later, another one appeared. Oh my God, two of them. But this one, it flew a bit lower, it flew in front of us, maybe a mile in front of us, but then it curved round. And at one point, it was dropping altitude, at one point, it flew across the face of Big Ben. I couldn't believe it. A rarity flying across the face of an iconic building. Who on earth will be seeing that right now? Probably no one. Because no one ever looks up. However, that particular moment, there was a guy having a cup of tea in a building looking north by the River Thames, and he saw this bird heading towards him, and it kept on coming, and it kept on coming until it hit the windscreen, or should I say the window of his building, and landed on the shelf. And he had the presence of mind to contact my group, and it turned out it was the same bird. But this bird, you'd be happy to know, shook itself off and then carried on its journey. But it's just amazing that birds like this, as well as common birds, habitually fly over our cities and we don't look up. So this whole exercise, which lasted about 12 years in the end, was a really great way of getting Londoners to notice that there are birds flying over their heads that they may never have actually considered. So that was one interesting piece of engagement. The other thing I want to tell you about, which I'm really quite proud of actually, is another idea I had, which came to me when I was a kid, when I was at school. I was 7 years old, looking out the window, really bored during a lesson. And I wondered if I did a poll, what would be my class's favourite bird? So I did a poll, and it turned out to be the sparrow, which I was really happy about. But I thought to myself, as a young 7-year-old, when I grow up, one day I'm going to ask that question again. So I grew up in 2014 I grew up. Because there was a general election in 2015 in England, and I thought, wouldn't it be great to run another election at the same time to see if Britain can vote for its national bird? Because back in the 60s, when England last won the World Cup, they still go on about this to this day. I don't understand. Anyway, back in those days, the robin, not your robin, by the way, or if you're from North America, not the North American thrush, as it should be called. The robin was anointed as Britain's favourite bird. There was no vote. It was just a bunch of crusty old men in an office deciding, we're going to do that. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to see if I can run the campaign to get Britain to vote. So what I did was to put together a logo, and that was my friend's doing. I hate that. Anyway, I put together a list of 60 species, which I got a committee together. Some of these people weren't birders. They were just general people, because I wanted to get 60 species that meant something to Britain. Some of them were cultural birds, skylark, things that are mentioned in Shakespeare and stuff like that. Some were sort of more contemporary, like pigeons, and rose-winged parakeets and things like that. And then a few other birds that people liked, like puffin and stuff like that. And what I did was, in August 2014, was to launch this whole initiative at the British Birdwatching Fair. And my idea was to get people within the sort of wildlife community to pick 10 of these 60 birds to then put the vote on to the public. Because I didn't want to be accused of picking the 10 birds myself. So the vote went as planned. Everyone came to my booth. I had about, in the end, 5,000 people come to my booth over the weekend. I voted myself. However, I did not vote for the robin at all. My vote went for the blackbird, sexy bird, the blackbird. And there's some other votes as well. And we got down to our final 10 eventually, but firstly I had a little stunt that I put together, because for those who might know me a little bit, there's a few of you guys that might know me a little bit. I'm a bit cheeky. And I organised for a lady to. I was doing this sort of mastermind quiz. I was in this quiz, and there's several other people in the quiz as well. And unbeknown to anyone, I organised for this lady to come out, and she was basically wearing nothing apart from what you can see. And she interrupted the quiz, and it caused great concern amongst the establishment. In fact, I could have been thrown out of the birding community, and I may not have been here today, actually, because they're really upset by it. But it trended on social media to launch the campaign. No animals were harmed in this at all. It's all made of synthetic stuff. So we got to the 10 birds to go to the public vote, and what I did was the 10 birds included, well, all of them were well known, but the 11th bird was a species called the hen harrier, which is, I guess, very closely related to the northern harrier here in North America. And I switched the kestrel with the hen harrier because I thought it'd be interesting. People would be looking through the list and recognize 9 of the species, and then the 10th one think, what's that? And when they Google the 10th one, they'd realize that the 10th one is in severe danger of extinction in the UK, illegally hunted. In England, the population should be around about 300 pairs, but at the time when I did this vote, there were just 3 pairs. They were illegally killed by gamekeepers. So I wanted to bring that conservation message discreetly into this whole campaign. So I launched it, and I also needed a campaign vehicle. So I approached the usual channels. I spoke to Ford, I spoke to all the big brands. They all said, get lost. And then I realized I had a friend who was a millionaire, as you do. And I said, you're not using a Rolls Royce, are you? And he said, no, not at all. So I bought it for £15. A Silver Shadow Mark II, I think it was, from 1973. And then I went through the process of pimping it up. So I got some guys on the case. They started making some livery, and it spent a few days in the garage. Looks better now, doesn't it? I waxed some speakers on the back. I mean, you have to, don't you? And then it was ready. So I launched this campaign, and by the way, before I started the campaign, I did approach all the bird NGOs in the UK, and I was really quite disappointed in that only a couple actually helped me. So I did this on my own, with friends, because I didn't get much support initially from those guys. Anyway, so I launched it, and I found someone who would do the PR for me at a really cut rate. She really believed in what I was doing, and that's another thing. I would ring up PR companies trying to get someone interested to help me at mates rates, and when I told them I was doing a Vote for Britain's national bird, they'd often laugh and then put the phone down or not even get back to me. So again, I was thinking, I thought you guys are supposed to be creatives. Anyway, there I was in the car. I had a driver, and I would drive around London. This is Abbey Road. Vote for Britain's national bird. I went to Abbey Road, as you know, famous place where the Beatles made their records. Vote for the blackbird. I drove past the Queen's house when she was around, of course. Vote for the swan, Your Majesty. So I got a lot of coverage, actually. My PR person worked out that I got between £8 to £9 million worth of presence on television, radio, and newspapers and print. So it was quite a challenge. Well, actually, she did very well, and it was a brilliant thing because in Britain you're not allowed to talk about the political process of the election because it's pretty boring anyway. So the media jumped on this, and it often made an "and finally" moment, And people would often ask me, "So David, who's winning?" Well, between you and I, the robin was winning by a country mile, but I'd say to them, "No, the blackbird's doing really well. The robin So yeah, I did a lot of interviews on radio, and I also got celebrities involved. This is Jamie Oliver, to endorse particular species, okay? So it was all working well in that respect. But then I had this idea, I thought, hang on a minute, we need to be talking to kids. It's okay, you know, adults, but we need to be talking to kids. Because the whole idea was that this vote would start from March until May the 6th, 2015, which was the day of the general election. And I knew that most people, most adults, would vote on the day of the general election. So I thought, we should get kids involved. So in the last minute, I emailed 22,000 schools in the UK with the idea that why don't you create a voting booth in your school and get the kids to vote on the day of the election. So their kids, their mothers and fathers are voting, and so are they. They're voting for something important too. So they learn about democracy, they learn about voting, but importantly, they also learn about birds, because obviously they're doing research on the birds to find out which one they wanted to vote for. And hopefully, one or two of them might think, I might want to do this when I grow up. So that was the thinking. So there I was, I went to various schools around London. By the way, my campaign vehicle was great, but I realised that a tank of petrol in UK was £180 and it lasted 180 yards. So I couldn't take it outside. I wanted to take it to Scotland, but in the end I had to sort of leave it and drive it around London. So I got kids involved, and they really got into it in a big way. And on the actual day of the vote, 14,000 kids voted in Britain, which was brilliant. And interestingly, in the name of democracy, their vote actually affected the general vote. I hoped that the robin wouldn't be the winner, but it was. I was very disappointed to hear that, but the second bird was the blackbird, but the kids' vote, because of the Harry Potter effect, they voted for the barn owl, so the blackbird was pushed into third place. I was so unhappy. But then I realised, actually, this is pretty good, because the robin is a fantastic emblem for Britain. It's small, it's feisty, it picks fights, it's territorial, perfect. So it's actually a good bird. But what was interesting was the number of votes. In the end, I managed to get 250,000 people to vote on this. And it was... It was officially Britain's biggest vote by a single person in terms of, getting awareness and stuff. Not that it was recognised, unfortunately, by the NGOs. But then, I don't care. I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing it to try and get new people involved. What was interesting was in the voting process, one question was, are you a member of an NGO? And interestingly, of that 250,000 people, 60% were not members of any NGO. 60%. I was talking to people on the street, and that is what we need to do. Engage with people who would never think about this ever previously. I'd go into banks, I'd hear people talking, oh, I don't know much about birds, but I like magpies. People were talking, and that's what we need to get, people talking. Because once they start talking, I had this vision, I've got this dream, and this dream is that, I want to help create this conservation army. That's what I could term it as, a conservation army. People who are not necessarily vested like us, but they are empathetic to the actual idea of conservation. They understand that there is a door with the word environment written on it, which they can choose to walk past. And if they walk past it, that's fine. At least they've seen it. Or they can walk in and find out more about it. And I see myself in the work I try and do as being a bridge. I try and get people to come through this door and then explore this world which you guys occupy, and then you can help them all in their various different fields. So that's how I see the work that I try to do. I want to tell you one more story actually, which is quite very close to my heart, and it involves a country called Serbia. Now, Serbia, in the 90s, there was a terrible war. I'm sure you heard about it, and I got invited to Serbia about 15 or 16 years ago on the strength of my Tower 42 experiments. There was a big building, a tall building in Belgrade, and an ornithologist approached me and said, we'd love you to come over and set up a migration watch point there. So I said, fine. And I was on my way to Serbia and I was thinking, I'm not going to like this. You know, these people, I don't think I'm going to like these people, you know, given the atrocities of the 90s. But when I got to Belgrade, I was so surprised. I mean, the men, they're big, they're shaven-headed, they got deep voices, and they hug you. The women are lovely too, but we'll talk about that maybe over a drink. And I remember being in Belgrade, standing on top of a tall building with a bunch of people who never even seen a bird, or never thought about birds. And again, it's a classic, oh, my mum lives there and I live over there. But then they started seeing birds, and we saw eagles, you know, we saw all sorts of different birds, and it was just a one-off. But then apparently it carried on, which was great. But the tourism board then said to me, why don't you come back? We'd like to show you around. So the following year, I came back in the spring, and I remember being with my guide, Milan, who's now my Serbian brother. Me and him are tight, but at the time I didn't know him, but he took me around Serbia, and we kind of headed north past Belgrade and past Novi Sad, heading towards the border with Hungary, and on the way, seeing the classic birds that you would see in that region, so things like bee-eaters, which look like motmots, and rollers and things like that, so all sorts of general birds. But then he saw me hankering, because I was shaking, so I needed a bit of urban birding. I needed an urban birding fix. So he took me to a small town in the north, right by the border of Hungary, and we went into this park. And in this park were trees. It's quite a wooded park, and there were people walking their dogs, holding hands, all the stuff you normally do in the park. And then we stood by a tree and we looked up, and in that tree was a long-eared owl. And I was thinking, oh my God, that's amazing. I don't see long-eared owls at all, you know. And then my colleague Milan, he does a brilliant impersonation. He called the owl and he'd look down. But then I looked in this wood and I realized that there was a rookery of crows, rooks, and kestrels nesting, which I've never seen so many kestrels nesting together. But unbelievably, there were 22 pairs of long-eared owls nesting semi-colonially. Now, I don't know how much you know about long-eared owls. Normally, you never find a nest for love nor money. Normally, they're so sparsely populated, you never see more than 2 or 3. 22 of them. So I subsequently collapsed. When I was brought around, I said, I don't believe this. What's going on? How come there's so many owls here? How come I didn't know about this? He said, well, the thing is, they nest in nest boxes like this, we put up for them. They also nest in wicker baskets in the open. I remember seeing an owl sitting in the open on a nest, and above him, or her, was a kestrel, and every time the owl turned its head, the kestrel's tail was touching his head. I was like, Jesus, what's going on? Why are there so many owls? Well, the reason was the fact that the farming methods there in Serbia were similar to what Britain was maybe 150 years ago. So effectively, it was very low intensity. When they farmed, they left grain on the ground. The barns had no walls, so you saw the grain and the corn everywhere. And there were millions upon millions of rodents. It's a rodent paradise. So during the day, the kestrels fed on the rodents, and at night, the owls came out to play. But he also told me something else that was quite interesting. So I thought, okay. So later on that year, I returned with a bunch of people who had never seen an owl of any description in the wild. And I took them to northern Serbia to a town called Kikinda. Now, Kikinda at the time was unknown. no one really heard about it outside of northern Serbia. When I first went there, I couldn't believe walking the streets and seeing what I saw, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But anyway, we got to our hotel in Kikinda. It was dark, we had our dinner, we walked around the park. Oh, there's an owl! Oh, whoa, you ain't seen nothing yet, I said to the people. Because the following day, we walked around the streets of that town and several other towns. And I tell you what, there's no one here under the age of 16, is there? Because I'm going to talk about owl porn now. I'm going to show you some pictures of owls. I couldn't believe the numbers of owls in the streets, in the trees, in the parks, in the cemeteries, in people's gardens. They were everywhere. Some trees had several birds, and whenever you counted X amount of birds, Y will fly out, double the amount will fly out, because they were just all over the place. And my jaw was hitting the ground when I first saw all this, even like on this. I remember walking into Kikinda, and they got a town square, which is a very normal, classic town square, and within that town square, it was like walking into a Harry Potter set, because there were roughly about 400 owls in the trees, and they all kind of sit there and look at you. The record count is 850, I think, or something like that, in that one town. It's just incredible, the numbers in that one town, but generally in that area, there is a lot of owls. My friend Milan, he said part of the reason why we didn't know about this was, or we being people outside of Serbia, was that he was busy surveying the owls, number one, to see how many there were, but also trying to re-educate the people, the local people, because they saw owls as birds of doom, to be killed on sight. So he had a lot of re-education to do. He didn't have time to promote the idea that these birds were there. And also he estimated that along the border of Serbia and Hungary, remember the map from earlier, there were perhaps 35,000 owls wintering there, 35,000. To put that into perspective, someone told me that in North America there can't be more than 4,000 to 5,000 in the whole continent. So it shows you how rich that is. And it's in the middle of somewhere, not in the middle of nowhere. And part of the reason why the owls congregate in these towns is because the outer countryside, the trees have been chopped down for agriculture. So it's all corn and stuff being grown, no trees. So it's a happy accident for the owls to come into the towns and actually benefit from the city island heat effect, the fact that the cities are slightly warmer, the towns, and also the fact that you've got less chance of being hunted. And over the years, they've also noted that other species of owls are now joining them. Short-eared owls, which are notoriously kind of very sort of single, they often hang out with these guys as well, but you can tell the difference in their behavior, because every evening, just as it gets dark, the long-eared owls seem to stretch their wings, they fly on top of a church or another tree before heading off into the countryside, whereas the short-eared owls, they sort of lasso up into the sky in ever-increasing circles and then fly off into the countryside, and they're much warier, much more wary. So my sort of story here is that 14 years ago I discovered this whole phenomenon, and for 14 years, apart from the pandemic, I've been bringing people to this country, ecotourism. I'm one of the few, if not the only person in Britain doing it anyway. Every year, there's loads of people now come to this area, and in particular, Kikinda, which is now deemed as the owl capital of the world. Now, you go there, and you walk around, there's shops selling owl paraphernalia. You can buy a t-shirt there, you can buy a cup, you can buy all sorts of things with owls on it. Every November, owls in this particular owl is called Sova in Serbian, so November's now called Sovember, and kids spend the whole month dressed up as owls. They learn about owls in schools, and some of these schools, the windows look onto owl roosts, so they've got the owls to look at as they've been taught about the owls. So these kids are growing up thinking these owls are great. The local people are loving it because it's boosted their economy. You know, Kikinda was unknown, now it's on the ornithological map. The best thing of all, which I'm really proud of, is the fact that the government have made that concrete square with a few juniper trees a nature reserve. Anyone caught disturbing the owls, particularly at Christmas, could be fined up to 10,000 euros in the middle of somewhere. That's amazing. And I was so delighted by that. So it's a place you need to go to if you ever have the opportunity. But more than that, it shows how important urban areas can be and should be for birds. It doesn't need to be a big expanse of land. It could be an area on a roof. It could be a tiny little patch in your yard. It doesn't matter, because if everyone does that, there becomes this mosaic of habitat, which then becomes a corridor. And that's the message that I'm trying to get across with what I'm doing in terms of ecotourism. But at the end of the day, it's all about engagement. As everyone said previously, and everyone will say throughout this whole conference, it's about getting people who never thought they'd love birds and love wildlife to show that love. Doesn't mean picking up a pair of binoculars. You don't have to do that. You don't have to know anything about birds. You don't need to have any experience. You don't need to have X amount of birds on your list by 1 month. You don't need anything. All you need to do is to be on that wavelength. All you need to do is open up your heart, your mind and your soul, and just feel this nature, feel it. That's all you need to do, and it's so easy, and it makes you feel great. It's so good, it's so grounding. And I'm so happy that now, people have now discovered that, yeah, it's great for, your well-being. Of course it is, and we've all known that for decades. But I'm glad it's out there in the open. I'm glad that people are prescribing this connection. But what we need to make sure is that people in urban areas in particular understand that they can access this as well. You don't need to go anywhere, because nature is all around us. And the problem is, many of us are disconnected in urban areas because we think that nature is either on a David Attenborough program or in the middle of nowhere, you'll never be able to get to it. It's on our doorstep, and that's where it starts. It connects to everywhere. It's from our doorsteps. So I just want to thank everyone at Birds Caribbean for inviting me. It's been amazing. I'm really looking forward to learning more about the work that's been done here, conservation-wise, but also to spread that message everywhere, because it's not just about here. And your stories should be international, not just in this region. It should be spreading out across the world and influencing other people. Thank you very much. Microphone.